Hello there, restful hearts. Tonight, we follow the story of a girl who died on a bridge and woke up as the very thing she had spent 3 years trying never to become, and of a cure that everyone wanted for entirely different reasons, and of an ancient evil buried so deep beneath the earth that raising it would cost more than anyone was prepared to pay. This is the story of Mystic Falls in its darkest season, where love became uncertain, grief became unbearable, and the line between the living and the dead grew thinner with every choice made. So breathe easy and let the entire story, every sacrifice, every secret, every love that refused to let go, unfold softly as you drift into sleep. The town of Mystic Falls had seen its share of impossible things. It had weathered the arrival of original vampires and the breaking of ancient curses and the deaths of people who should never have died so young. And it had absorbed each of these events the way small towns absorb all tragedies, by continuing, by finding ways to carry the weight forward into ordinary days that somehow persisted despite everything pressing down upon them. But the morning that Elena Gilbert woke up in transition was different from all the mornings that had come before it, because this time the impossible thing had happened not to someone else, not to a stranger or an enemy, or even a beloved friend, but to the girl at the very center of everything. The girl whose survival had been the fixed point around which 3 years of sacrifice and love and terrible decision-making had orbited without rest. It had begun the night before on Wickery Bridge, which had already claimed more than its share of significance in Elena's life. Her parents had died on that bridge when she was a child, their car going into the water with Elena inside it, and Stefan Salvatore had pulled her free on that same night and changed the direction of everything that followed. Now the bridge had taken her a second time, though the circumstances were different and the outcome was not yet certain. Rebecca Mickelson had run Matt Donovan's truck off the road in the dark, and the vehicle had gone into the river, and Eleanor had been inside it when it sank. Stefan had arrived in the water with speed and desperation, and the particular focused grief of someone who could not survive losing the person he was trying to save. And he had followed Damon's instruction, the instruction Eleanor herself had given, and pulled Matt from the car first. When Stefan returned for Elena, she was already gone, her lungs full of rivers, water, her body cooling in the current, the bridge taking her the same way it had taken her parents years before. What neither Stefan nor Damon had known, what Eleanor herself had not known, was that Dr. Meredith Fell had given Eleanor vampire blood earlier that same evening to treat a head injury, acting without consent in the way she occasionally did when she believed the medical situation required it. The blood had been in Elena's system when she drowned, which meant that Elena Gilbert had not simply died on Wickery Bridge. She had died with vampire blood in her veins, and that changed everything, and not in a way that could be undone or wished away or fixed through any amount of love or regret or desperate wanting. She woke in transition. The word itself is almost too gentle for what it describes. Transition implies gradual movement, implies progress from one state to another, with some grace or continuity, implies that the person moving through it retains some agency over the process. What Eleanor woke into was not graceful and was not gradual. She woke on a table in the Salvatore boarding house, with the world hitting her like a physical force. Every sense she had possessed as a human multiplied beyond recognition. The light too bright and the sounds too close, and the smell of everything around her so immediate and so layered that she could not initially separate one thing from another. She could hear Stefan's heartbeat and Damon's footsteps and the wind moving through the trees outside and the particular way the old house settled under its own weight. All of it arriving simultaneously with equal urgency. None of it filtered or softened by the ordinary limitations of human perception. She was not yet a vampire. That is the particular cruelty of transition. The thing that makes it its own specific kind of suffering. She was somewhere between what she had been and what she would become. And she had a choice. Though choice is perhaps not quite the right word for something that carries such impossible weight. She could feed on human blood within the next several hours and complete her transition and become a vampire. The thing she had said since the very beginning of everything that she never wanted to be. Or she could refuse to feed, and the transition would fail, and she would simply die permanently and finally, with no resurrection and no return. Damon's devastation in these first hours was not quiet. He had loved Eleanor with a particular intensity of someone who had spent years pretending otherwise. And the knowledge of what had happened on the bridge was almost more than he could manage without losing himself to the rage and grief that were his most natural responses to unbearable pain. He had arranged for Matt to be saved first because Elena had asked him to, because she had looked at him and told him that if it ever came to a choice, Matt was the one who needed to come home. And Damon had honored that request even though every instinct he possessed had screamed against it. He had done what she asked, and she had died anyway. And the result was that Elena was lying in transition on a table in his house, and the future had been rewritten without anyone's permission. Stefan's guilt was quieter but no less consuming. He had pulled Matt from the water. He had followed the instruction. He had come back for Elena, and she had been gone. And the fact that he had done exactly what was asked of him did not make the weight of it any lighter or the outcome any easier to hold. Stefan Salvatore had spent 3 years making Eleanor's humanity his reason for existing as a compassionate vampire rather than a destructive one. And now her humanity was the very thing in question. And there was nothing he could do in this moment except wait and hope and try to be present in whatever way she needed. Lena's emotions during transition were amplified in the way that all a new vampire's emotions are amplified. But for Elena, specifically, who had always felt things deeply even by human standards, the amplification was devastating in its completeness. Her grief for her parents, which she had spent years learning to carry without being crushed by it, returned with the full force of its original impact. Her confusion about Damon and Stefan, the love she had for both of them, and her uncertainty about what that love meant and what it asked of her, became so immediate and so present. that it was nearly indistinguishable from physical pain. Everything she had ever felt was still there, every layer of every complicated emotion, but stripped of the human ability to manage and moderate and set aside, turned up to a volume that had no ceiling and no relief. The town around them continued in its ordinary way, which was its own kind of surreal contrast. The memorial for the deaths at the young farm drew the community together in grief. Pastor Young, having blown up the council in what appeared at the time to be an act of sudden madness, and Mystic Falls was processing its losses in the public communal way that small towns process tragedy, with food and gathering and the particular solemnity of people who have agreed together to mark something as significant. The school held its own moment of quiet recognition. And through all of it, Eleanor's closest friends carried the knowledge of what was actually happening, the weight of it invisible to everyone around them, the ordinary grief of the town proceeding entirely unaware of the impossible grief happening at the Salvatore boarding house. Stefan told her about the cure in those early hours, gently and with the particular care of someone offering something fragile to someone who might shatter. There were rumors, he said, more than rumors, actual evidence that a cure for vampirism existed somewhere in the world, that it had existed for a very long time, and that finding it was possible for people who were willing to search. He would find it for her, he promised. If she chose to complete her transition, if she chose to survive, he would spend whatever it took to find the cure and give her back the human life that had been taken from her without her consent. It was that promise, more than anything else, that gave her the ability to make the choice she made, not because she was certain she wanted the cure, not because she had resolved the question of what she wanted her life to be or what kind of creature she could live with becoming, but because the promise meant that completing her transition was not necessarily permanent, that choosing to survive was not the same as choosing forever, that she could cross this threshold and still have something to reach toward on the other side of it. She fed from a blood bag at the hospital. Meredith fell watching with the clinical compassion of someone who understood exactly what she was witnessing and had made her peace with her own role in it. The blood moved through her and the transition completed, and Eleanor Gilbert, 18 years old, became a vampire. Her first full day inside her new nature was overwhelming in the way that only things which cannot be prepared for are overwhelming. The colors of the world saturated beyond anything she had perceived before, the sounds of the town arriving with the intimacy of things heard through walls that no longer existed, the smell of human blood reaching her from distances that would have been impossible 24 hours earlier. She moved differently, with a precision and a speed that her body understood before her mind caught up, her reflexes operating ahead of her intention in ways that were disorienting and strange, and also, underneath the strangeness, something that she could not quite name but that felt almost like capability. She fed from Matt on Wickery Bridge because it was where she needed to be, because the bridge was where so much of her story had been written and rewritten, because confronting what she was in the place that had made her what she was felt necessary in some way she could not fully articulate. She struggled to stop, the bloodlust pulling at her with more urgency than she had expected, the desire to simply continue overwhelming the part of her that remembered being human and caring about consequences. Stefan was there with her, steady and patient, his hand on her arm, his voice quiet, and she pulled back, and Matt was safe. And she stood on the bridge in the night air with blood on her lips and the full weight of her new existence settling over her like something she would have to learn to wear. She was the thing she had feared. She was alive. And somewhere in the distance, the people who loved her were already moving, already searching, already trying to find a way to give her back the choice that the bridge had taken away. There is a particular kind of suffering that comes not from losing something, but from no longer being able to trust that what you have is real. From looking at the most intimate and certain parts of your own interior life and finding that they have become questions rather than answers, that the feelings you would have sworn were yours and only yours have been placed under a shadow that no amount of wanting can quite dispel. This was the suffering that settled over Elena Gilbert in the weeks following her transition, layered on top of everything else she was already carrying, arriving not with dramatic announcement, but with the quiet and incremental devastation of a doubt that grows in the dark when no one is watching, and emerges fully formed only when the moment of reckoning can no longer be deferred. Elena had moved into the Salvatore boarding house in those early weeks because it was the practical choice, because learning to be a vampire required guidance from people who understood what she was experiencing, because Stefan and Damon both wanted her close and safe, and the house gave her access to both of them without requiring her to navigate the empty Gilbert home alone with its particular weight of memory and absence. The arrangement was understood by everyone as temporary, as a crisis measure rather than a permanent reconfiguration of anyone's life. But temporary things have a way of becoming something else when the circumstances around them refuse to resolve, when the crisis that justified the arrangement simply continues and deepens and branches into new complications before the original ones have been adequately addressed. Her emotions as a new vampire remained overwhelming in the way that all new vampires' emotions overwhelm. But Elena's particular history meant that what was overwhelming her was not simple bloodlust or sensory confusion, but the full accumulated weight of everything she had felt across 18 years of human life returned to her without the gradual distance that time normally provides. Grief that she had processed and carefully set aside came back as immediate and fresh as the day it first arrived, carrying its original texture and its original force, without any of the softening that years of living past it should have produced. Love that she had learned to hold carefully at the particular angle that allowed her to function without being consumed by it, expanded past every careful boundary she had established and became impossible to manage at its new volume. She was not simply a new vampire learning to exist inside an unfamiliar nature. She was a person whose entire emotional history had been returned to her at full intensity simultaneously, with no buffer and no relief, and no gradual reintroduction. She could not feed from blood bags initially, and this was a practical problem with practical consequences that compounded everything else. The animal blood that Stefan had always relied upon sat wrong in her system, in ways that made her physically ill, her body rejecting it with a consistency that could not be attributed to simple adjustment difficulty or new vampire inexperience. The blood bags that Damon occasionally used produced the same result, her system refusing every alternative to the direct source with stubborn and inconvenient regularity. She was a new vampire who could only feed directly from humans, which meant she needed a particular kind of help, the kind that required proximity and trust, and a willingness to be vulnerable in front of someone who already saw her more clearly than she was entirely comfortable with. Damon taught her. This was the straightforward fact of it, the practical reality that shaped everything that followed in ways that nobody planned and nobody quite anticipated. He taught her to feed from humans using compulsion, to make them forget, to take what she needed without causing lasting harm, to manage the bloodlust with a particular discipline that came from decades of practice rather than weeks of desperate attempting. He was patient with her in a way that people who had only ever witnessed his worst qualities would not have recognized as belonging to him. His teaching careful and consistent and stripped to the performance and the deflection that he typically used to maintain the emotional distance he preferred. He did not perform patience for her benefit. He simply was patient because she needed it and because he was capable of it. When something mattered enough to him, and she mattered enough, had always mattered enough, even when he had made choices that suggested otherwise. The closeness that the teaching required was not manufactured or sought, but simply the natural result of two people spending hours together in the particular intimacy of one person's vulnerability and another person's competence. Eleanor was frightened of what she was and frightened of what she was capable of, and Damon was the person who kept showing her, through patient repetition and genuine steadiness, that what she was did not have to destroy her or the people around her. She stopped being frightened in his presence in a way that she had not stopped being frightened anywhere else. She began to relax into her new nature with him beside her in a way that felt organic and necessary and real. And the feeling of safety she found with him was layered under everything else that was developing between them, providing a foundation that the more complicated feelings built upon without her fully registering the construction. It was Tyler Lockwood who first said it aloud, not to Eleanor or to Damon, but to Caroline, in the careful and uncomfortable way of someone delivering information they know will cause pain, but cannot in good conscience withhold. Tyler had been sired to Klaus, had spent months understanding from the inside what it felt like to be bound to another person's will through the particular supernatural mechanism that affected hybrids, and, as it would turn out, certain vampires as well. The sire bond, he explained to Caroline with the patient detail of someone who had lived inside its effects and examined them carefully, did not feel like compulsion from the inside. It did not feel like being controlled or manipulated or made to act against your own genuine desires. It felt like genuine feeling. It felt like authentic preference. It felt like love. The sired person experiencing their attachment to the sire as entirely their own, as arising naturally from within, rather than being imposed or shaped from without. The bond expressed itself through the sired person's existing emotions, amplifying and directing feelings that were already present, rather than manufacturing feelings from nothing, which made it almost impossible to identify from inside the experience of it. Eleanor had transitioned on Damon's blood. This was the fact at the center of everything, the piece of information that, once surfaced, could not be set aside or reasoned away or wished into irrelevance through the force of anyone's desire for a different truth. months earlier, when Elena had needed vampires' blood to survive a serious injury, Damon had been the one whose blood she received on that particular occasion. She had not transitioned then, had not died with it in her system and completed the change. But when she drowned on Wickery Bridge, with Meredith Fell's blood already present, the question of which vampire's blood had carried her through her transition became impossible to answer cleanly and simply. The evidence pointed toward Damon. The implications of that evidence were not small. Stefan and Caroline investigated together with the shared and urgent focus of two people who understood that they needed the truth even while part of them dreaded what the truth would require of everyone. They consulted Tyler extensively across several conversations, asking him to describe in specific and practical terms the behavioral markers of sire bond influence, the patterns that reliably distinguished bonded behavior from simply genuine attachment and genuine preference. What they assembled from those conversations was a recognizable portrait. Someone under the influence of a sire bond followed the sire's suggestions with unusual and immediate compliance. They found themselves suddenly capable of things they had previously struggled with when the sire expressed desire for that capability. They defended the sire with a disproportionate intensity that exceeded what the circumstances or the relationship's history should have produced. Their emotional attachment intensified specifically in the sire's presence in ways that went beyond anything the pre-existing relationship adequately explained. Elena, when this framework was presented to her, was furious in the complete and consuming way that only felt entirely justified from inside it. The fury was understandable and genuine. The particular anger of someone being told that the most important and most intimate things they feel about their own life might not be entirely or straightforwardly their own, that their interior experience might be shaped by forces operating below the level of their awareness and entirely without their consent. She had spent 3 years as a human woman, knowing her own mind, making difficult choices about complicated feelings, choosing between two brothers who both loved her with the full force of people incapable of moderate attachment, and every choice she had made had been hers, costly and hard, and completely her own. The suggestion that what she felt for Damon might be something other than simply what she felt for Damon was not information she could receive without resistance. And her resistance was fierce and immediate and entirely understandable. But the test that Damon performed was unambiguous in a way that left no comfortable alternative interpretation available. Elena had been unable to feed from blood bags since her transition, her body consistently and without exception rejecting them across weeks of attempting. The difficulty a source of ongoing practical inconvenience that nobody had been able to explain or resolve. Damon suggested, quietly and without drama or pressure, that she try the blood bag again. He framed it as a simple request, calm and low stakes, without argument or persuasion or any particular weight, beyond the expression of a preference for a different outcome. Elena picked up the blood bag. She could feed from it without difficulty. The persistent obstacle that had resisted weeks of effort dissolving at his single, quiet expression of wanting her to succeed. The sire bond was not a theory anymore. What followed was the specific kind of pain that the situation had been building toward through all its layers of complication and avoidance. The pain that arrives when a truth that has been approaching for some time finally arrives completely and cannot be sent away. Stefan ended his relationship with Elena. He did it without cruelty and without drama, in the careful and quiet way of someone who has accepted that a necessary thing is necessary, and that this acceptance does not make the doing of it any less painful, only more possible. While the sire bond existed, he told her, he could not know whether her feelings were genuine. And she could not know either. She could not trust her own emotional perceptions about Damon, when a supernatural mechanism might be shaping those perceptions below the level of her awareness and entirely outside her consent. And he was not willing to hold her to a relationship conducted under those conditions, not because he no longer loved her, but because loving her meant refusing to take advantage of her uncertainty. The relationship between Stefan and Elena had been the emotional foundation of 3 years of everything the show had built. It had survived his Ripper period and her growing closeness with Damon and the chaos of original vampires and the accumulated deaths and near-deaths and impossible decisions that had piled up around them across 3 seasons like sediment. It ended not with betrayal and not with the gradual wearing away of feeling, but with a question that had no clean answer, with the tragedy of 2 people separated not by anything either of them chose, but by the impossibility of certainty in the face of supernatural interference. There was no villain in the ending. There was only the bond and the shadow it cast, reaching backward across every feeling Eleanor had experienced in the preceding months and making each one impossible to hold with confidence. Damon's position throughout all of this was complicated in ways that his habitual emotional deflection was not built to manage without cost. He loved Elena. This had not been a secret to anyone paying attention for the past 3 years, but it had existed at a useful remove, at the level of acknowledged tension rather than acknowledged reality, and the sire bond had collapsed that distance in ways that were deeply uncomfortable for him. He could not take satisfaction in what was happening. He could not allow himself the relief of Elena's feelings being finally and clearly present when he could not determine whether those feelings were genuinely hers or whether they were something his blood had written into her without her knowledge or her agreement. The thing he had wanted had apparently arrived, and he could not trust its arrival, which was its own particular and exhausting form of cruelty. He made the decision to send Elena away. He sent her to Denver with Jeremy, putting geographical distance between them with the deliberate intention of testing whether the bond would weaken or alter or reveal its nature more clearly when she was not in daily proximity to him, whether her feelings would shift or clarify or simply remain exactly as they were when the person she might be sired to was no longer present. It was the most genuinely unselfish thing Damon Salvatore had done in years, and the boarding house was quieter after she left in ways that had nothing to do with the volume of any sound and everything to do with the particular absence of one specific presence. Elena left carrying the question of her own heart like something she had no safe place to set down, not knowing whether what she felt for Damon was the most honest thing she had ever experienced, or a beautiful and elaborate construction built by something operating below the level of her choosing. The question would not resolve quickly or easily, or on anyone's preferred timeline. But underneath all its supernatural complexity, it was the most human question imaginable. The question of whether we can ever fully trust what we feel to be genuinely and entirely our own. And Eleanor Gilbert would have to live inside it for a long time before anything resembling an answer became possible. Hope is a complicated thing to offer someone who is still in the process of absorbing a loss they did not choose. It can feel like comfort, and it can feel like pressure simultaneously, like being handed a map to a destination you are not yet certain you want to reach, like being told that the thing taken from you can be recovered before you have fully understood what it meant that it was taken at all. Stefan's promise to Elena about the cure existed in exactly this complicated territory, offered with genuine love and genuine intention, received with genuine gratitude and genuine uncertainty, the two of them standing on either side of a question that neither of them could yet answer cleanly. Did Elena want to be human again? She did not know, but the possibility that she could be if she decided she wanted to was something she held onto in those early weeks with the particular grip of someone who needs an option, even when they are not ready to exercise it. The first concrete indication that the cure was not simply legend or rumor arrived in the form of Connor Jordan. And Connor Jordan arrived in Mystic Falls the way that genuinely dangerous things often arrive, without announcement and without the particular atmosphere of threat that might have prompted more immediate caution. He appeared to be a hunter, which was true, and he appeared to be working alone, which was also true, but the nature of what he was hunting and the supernatural origins of his compulsion to hunt it were things that revealed themselves gradually and at considerable cost to the people who encountered him before they understood what they were dealing with. Connor was methodical in the way that people who have organized their entire existence around a single purpose become methodical. His approach to identifying and eliminating vampires informed by knowledge and equipment that went beyond anything the Mystic Falls group had previously encountered from human hunters. He carried weapons modified specifically for vampire physiology, his understanding of their nature detailed and practical and entirely unsentimental. He had tattoos on his hand and arm that most people could not see, markings that were invisible to ordinary human perception and invisible to vampires, but that certain individuals with a particular and as yet undefined connection to his heritage could perceive with complete clarity. Jeremy could see the tattoos. This detail emerged with the quiet significance of something that would matter enormously before anyone fully understood why. Jeremy, noticing the markings on Connor's skin during an early encounter and mentioning it with the uncertain tone of someone reporting something they cannot explain. The ability to see a hunter's tattoos, it would later be understood, was not a random quirk of perception. It was evidence of potential, of an inherited or destined connection to the brotherhood Connor belonged to, of something in Jeremy Gilbert that had not yet been named or activated, but that was present and waiting. Connor's campaign in Mystic Falls escalated quickly from reconnaissance to direct action. He rigged the Mystic Grill with explosives and used it as a trap, taking hostages from among the group's human connections and creating a situation designed to draw vampires into the open, where his weapons could be deployed most effectively. The standoff that resulted was tense and dangerous, in the particular way of situations where the person holding the leverage has nothing to lose and complete conviction on their side. Connor's certainty about what he was doing and why he was doing it, making negotiation nearly impossible and direct intervention enormously risky. Elena killed him. She did it to protect the people inside the building, acting with the speed and the instinct of a new vampire whose protective impulses had not yet been tempered by experience or by the particular moral weight that accumulates around taking a life even when that life was threatening others. The kill was fast, and it was necessary by the logic of the moment, and it was devastating in its aftermath. Not because Elena regretted the protection of her friends, but because killing Connor activated something that nobody had warned her about and nobody had anticipated. The hunter's curse descended on her almost immediately. A supernatural punishment visited upon anyone who killed a member of the five before the hunter's purpose had been fulfilled. Connor appeared to her not as hallucination she could reason away or manage through ordinary psychological effort, but as persistent and vivid and taunting presence that followed her through every waking hour, his voice in her ear and his image at the edges of her vision, his ghost making her question her own perceptions in ways that compounded the already considerable difficulty of being a new vampire navigating an amplified emotional landscape. The curse pushed her toward the edge of something, toward a darkness that the people around her watched approaching with increasing alarm and inadequate tools for intervention. It was through the investigation of Connor's nature and the hunter's curse that the broader mythology began to surface. The older and stranger history that connected a 12th century brotherhood to an ancient immortal being to a cure that had been hidden for 2,000 years. Klaus and Rebecca were the sources of this history, their 1,000 years of existence giving them access to knowledge that even the most well-researched contemporary vampire would not possess. Their memories of the original five hunters providing context that transformed Connor from simply a dangerous individual into a piece of an enormous and ancient puzzle. The five were explained with a particular weight of things that have been true for a very long time without most people knowing it. In the 12th century, 5 hunters had been created with supernatural gifts specifically designed for the purpose of finding and destroying Silas, an ancient immortal whose existence predated the vampire species entirely, and whose power was of a different and more fundamental order than anything the Mikkelsen family had encountered in their own considerable history. Each of the 5 hunters carried a tattoo that functioned as a map, a set of markings that grew and evolved as the hunter fulfilled kills, that would only become complete and readable when the hunter had accumulated sufficient kills to activate the full extent of the map. The completed tattoo, read correctly, would lead to Silas's tomb, and in Silas's tomb, placed there by the witch who had entombed him, was a cure. The cure had not been created for vampires. This was an important distinction that the group absorbed with varying degrees of attention to its implications. It had been created specifically to undo Silas's immortality, to make him mortal and therefore truly killable, to give the hunters who found him the means to end his existence permanently rather than simply containing it. But a cure for immortality, in principle, was a cure for any immortality, and the possibility that it could restore a vampire to human life was one that Rebecca and Stefan both seized upon with the urgency of people who had been waiting without knowing they were waiting for exactly this information. Atticus Shane entered this expanding picture with the particular quality of someone who has been present at the edges of events for longer than anyone realized. His visibility increasing as the mythology deepened in ways that in retrospect made his earlier appearances feel less coincidental than they had seemed at the time. Shane was an occult studies professor, credentialed and professionally respectable in ways that provided excellent cover for knowledge that went considerably beyond academic interest in supernatural history. He had been advising the town council, which had given him proximity to the center of Mystic Falls' supernatural activity, and he knew about Silas with a specificity and a personal investment that pure scholarly interest did not adequately explain. His motives were not yet clear, but the texture of his involvement had the quality of someone working toward a specific outcome rather than simply sharing information, someone whose helpfulness was purposeful rather than generous, whose knowledge was being deployed in service of something he had not yet disclosed. The group needed him because he understood things they did not, because the Silas mythology was complex and ancient and required interpretation that neither Klaus's memories nor Rebecca's provided completely, because the path to the cure ran through knowledge that Shane appeared to possess in abundance. The dependency was uncomfortable, and nobody was unaware of it, but the alternative was proceeding in ignorance, which carried its own considerable risks. Klaus's position on the cure introduced a complication that the group had perhaps anticipated, but had not fully mapped in terms of its practical consequences. He did not want it found. His objection was not sentimental or ideological, but strategic and self-interested in the way that Klaus's objections to most things were strategic and self-interested. Silas, he explained when pressed, was not simply an ancient and powerful immortal who could be managed or negotiated with or contained through sufficient supernatural force. Silas was something older and more dangerous than anything currently living, a being whose power operated on a different level than vampires or witches or werewolves, whose awakening would threaten not just the Cullen family's careful peace, but the entire existing supernatural order. Klaus had survived 1,000 years by being the most dangerous thing in any room he entered, and Silas was one of the very few entities about whom that calculation did not apply. His hybrid army provided additional and more immediately practical motivation for preventing the cure from being found. A cure for vampirism threatened the entire concept of his sire bond over his hybrids, and his hybrids were Klaus's primary source of power and security in the ongoing political landscape of the supernatural world. The cure represented not just a philosophical threat to immortality as a condition, but a direct and material threat to everything Klaus had spent decades constructing as his protection against a world full of people who wanted him dead. Stefan and Rebecca's alliance around the search for the cure was uneasy and somewhat improbable given their history, but it was also genuine in the way that shared purpose sometimes creates genuine connection between people who would not otherwise choose each other's company. Rebecca wanted the cure for herself, with a longing that had nothing performative about it. Her 1,000 years of vampire existence having cost her things, she still mourned with the fresh grief of someone who had never been given sufficient time to process any individual loss before the next one arrived. Stefan wanted it for Eleanor, his love for her taking the particular form of wanting to restore what had been taken from her, of believing that the best thing he could do now that their relationship had ended was give her back the choice that Wickery Bridge had removed. Jeremy's place in the unfolding plan clarified as the mythology deepened around him. The cure required a complete hunter's mark to provide the map to Silas's location, and a complete hunter's mark required a fully activated hunter of the 5. Connor was dead, but Jeremy could see the tattoos, and the ability to see a hunter's markings was, as the group was beginning to understand with a mixture of hope and dread, that most useful information in Mystic Falls seemed to inspire. The beginning of something rather than simply an interesting detail. There are people who arrive in moments of crisis carrying exactly the knowledge the crisis requires, and the temptation when encountering such a person is to receive their knowledge gratefully without examining too carefully the question of why they have it or what their possession of it means about who they are and what they want. Atticus Shane was this kind of person, arriving in Mystic Falls at precisely the moment when the group needed someone who understood the Silas mythology deeply enough to make the cure seem findable rather than simply legendary. His credentials providing legitimacy and his manner providing reassurance in ways that were effective precisely because they were so well calibrated to what frightened and uncertain people needed to hear. He was a professor of occult studies at Whitmore College, which gave him an institutional identity that made his knowledge of supernatural history seem like professional expertise rather than personal obsession, a distinction that mattered more than it perhaps should have in determining how much trust he was extended in those early weeks of the group's investigation. He had been consulting with the town council on matters related to Mystic Falls' unusual history, a role that had given him access to the town's records and its people and its particular concentration of supernatural activity without requiring him to explain the full extent of his interest in any of it. He was charming in the deliberate way of people who understand charm as a tool rather than simply a quality, his warmth calibrated and his openness strategic, his willingness to share information always stopping just short of the point where sharing would have required him to reveal what he was actually working toward. His wife and son had died. This was the fact at the center of everything Shane was, the loss that had redirected a man who might otherwise have remained a genuine, if unusually knowledgeable academic, into something considerably more dangerous. He had lost them in circumstances that left him without the consolations that loss normally provides, without the gradual softening of grief that time produces, when the grieving person accepts that the dead are gone and will remain gone, and that life must be rebuilt around their absence rather than their impossible return. Shane had not accepted this. He had instead directed the full force of his considerable intelligence and his professional expertise toward the proposition that return was not impossible, that the rules governing the permanence of death were not fixed laws, but conditions that sufficiently powerful magic could circumvent. Silas, in Shane's understanding of the mythology, was not simply an ancient and dangerous immortal whose awakening would pose threat to the supernatural world. Silas was a being of such profound power that raising him would require and produce magic on a scale that could accomplish things ordinary magic could not, including the lowering of the veil between the living world and the other side, the supernatural purgatory where the dead were held after death. If the veil came down, even temporarily, the dead could return. Shane's wife could return. His son could return. Everything he had lost could be restored, and the cost of that, restoration, whatever it turned out to be, was a cost he had decided before beginning that he was willing to pay. Bonnie Bennett became central to his plan through a connection that he cultivated with patience and care across weeks of gradual approach. Bonnie was one of the most powerful witches the Bennett line had produced. Her abilities already remarkable by any standard, but she had been working within the limitations that traditional magic imposed on its practitioners, drawing from nature and from the ancestral power of her bloodline in ways that were sustainable and balanced but also bounded, capable of extraordinary things within a defined range and incapable of the kind of power that Shane's plan required. He introduced her to expression, presenting it as simply another form of magic, a different channel for abilities she already possessed, framing the distinction between expression and traditional magic as one of technique rather than of fundamental nature. Expression was not simply a different technique. This was the truth that Shane omitted from his careful introductions, the information that Bonnie's own instincts about magic should perhaps have surfaced more urgently than they did. Where traditional magic drew from nature and from the accumulated power of a witch's ancestral line, expression drew from something outside the natural order entirely, from a source that traditional witches considered not simply dangerous, but fundamentally wrong, a form of power that had no natural limits precisely because it operated outside the system of balance and consequence that governed all other magic. It was the most powerful form of magic available to a human practitioner, and it was powerful in the way that things with no natural limits are powerful, which is to say, without the constraints that make power usable rather than simply destructive. Bonnie felt the difference when she began working with expression, and she felt it as expansion rather than warning, which was the particular danger of it. She could do things with expression that her traditional magic had never permitted, her reach extending beyond the boundaries she had always worked within. The sensation of that extended capability intoxicating in the way that any significant increase in one's ability to affect the world tends to be intoxicating, especially for someone who had spent years using her power in service of protecting the people she loved, and who now found that protection suddenly more possible and more absolute than it had ever been before. Shane watched her progress with the satisfaction of someone whose plan was advancing on schedule, his encouragement consistent and his warnings entirely absent. The expression triangle was the architecture of Shane's plan, and it was an architecture he had been building in Mystic Falls long before the group understood that any construction was occurring. Raising Silas required 3 massacres, each one a sacrificial expression of sufficient scale to fuel the magic that the raising would require. The massacres had to consist of specific groups and specific numbers: 12 humans, 12 hybrids, 12 witches, and they had to be performed within the geographic boundaries of the expression triangle that Shane had mapped onto the landscape of Mystic Falls itself. The town's particular concentration of supernatural energy making it the ideal location for the kind of working he was planning. The first massacre had already happened before anyone in the group thought to connect it to Shane's plans, or to Silas, or to expression magic at all. Pastor Young had blown up the town council at the end of the previous summer in what had appeared to be an act of sudden and inexplicable violence. 12 members of the council dying in an explosion that the town had mourned and struggled to understand, and ultimately filed under the category of human breakdown under supernatural stress. The explanation was both simpler and more terrible than that. Shane had spent weeks in careful and psychologically sophisticated conversation with Pastor Young, a deeply religious man whose faith made him susceptible to a very specific kind of manipulation, convincing him through apparent and fraudulent contact with his deceased wife that the destruction of the council was an act of holy purpose, a sacrifice required by forces Young believed in completely, and that Shane had learned to impersonate with sufficient accuracy to be convincing. 12 humans had died in that explosion. The first point of Shane's expression triangle had been established. He had done it before anyone knew his name or understood what he was building, had laid the foundation of his plan inside an event that Mystic Falls had grieved and processed and moved past, the massacre complete, and its magical consequences already in motion by the time the group was sitting across from Shane in rooms where they trusted him to help them find a cure. The horror of this, when the group began to piece it together, was not simply the scale of what Shane had done or was planning to do. It was the methodology of it, the way he had found a man's grief and his faith, and had used both as instruments without hesitation or apparent moral discomfort, had looked at Pastor Young's love for his dead wife and seen in it nothing except a mechanism for producing a massacre on the required schedule. It was the way he'd been doing the same thing with Bonnie, finding her love for her friends and her desire to protect them, and using both to draw her deeper into expression magic without her informed consent. The parallel between the two manipulations becoming clearer and more disturbing the more completely it was understood. Jeremy's hunter mark continued growing through this period, each vampire kill adding to the tattoo map that spread across his skin. The accumulation of kills that were necessary to complete the map also accelerating the transformation of his personality in ways that the people closest to him found increasingly distressing. The hunter instinct was not simply an overlay on his existing character, but was actively reshaping it, the compulsion to hunt and kill vampires intensifying with every expansion of the mark. The Jeremy, who had always been defined by his love for his family and his loyalty to the people around him, becoming harder to find beneath the hunter who was emerging in his place. The group's debate about whether pursuing the cure was worth the costs it was accumulating was honest and unresolved, the competing motivations of its members making consensus impossible and making even the framing of the question difficult. Stefan wanted the cure for Elena. Rebecca wanted it for herself. Elena was no longer certain she wanted it at all, her experience of vampire existence deepening in ways that complicated her initial certainty that it was simply something to be reversed as quickly as possible. Damon was opposed to the entire endeavor with a consistency that went beyond simple preference. His opposition rooted in his belief that pursuing the cure was dangerous and that Eleanor was more than the human girl she was before the bridge, that what she had become was not a problem requiring a solution, but a person deserving acceptance. The debate had no winner. It simply continued underneath everything else, shaping decisions without resolving them, as the plan moved forward, and Shane watched from a careful and patient distance. Transformation is rarely a single moment. It is more often a gradual accumulation of changes so incremental that the person experiencing them and the people watching them both find themselves surprised when they look up one day and cannot locate the person they remember inside the person standing in front of them. Jeremy Gilbert's transformation into a hunter of the five followed this pattern with an accuracy that made it no less disturbing for being recognizable. The process unfolding across weeks in small steps that each seem manageable in isolation and that assembled themselves without anyone fully intending to allow it, into something that could not be reversed by simply deciding it had gone far enough. The mark had been growing since Connor's death, each kill adding new lines and symbols to the tattoo that spread across Jeremy's hand and forearm, and then further, the map expanding with the patient inevitability of something that operates according to its own schedule regardless of the preferences of the person carrying it. Jeremy could feel the difference after each addition, not in the way of physical sensation exactly, but in the way of something shifting in his interior landscape, a reorientation of instinct and attention and appetite that accompanied each expansion of the mark, the way weather changes accompany a shifting season, gradually and then completely and without asking permission. The hunter instinct was the most immediately practical problem because it was the most immediately dangerous one. A hunter of the five was not simply a person with supernatural fighting ability and a compelling tattoo. The hunter instinct was a drive, a compulsion built into the supernatural architecture of the five's creation, directing the hunter toward vampires with the same insistent urgency that hunger directs a person toward food, and with approximately the same capacity for rational override when it became sufficiently intense. Jeremy's instinct directed him toward vampires. His sister was a vampire. The people he had grown up loving and trusting and would have given anything to protect included several vampires, and the mark on his arm did not make exceptions for people he cared about. He attacked Elena. This happened more than once, not because Jeremy was cruel or because he had stopped loving his sister, but because the instinct was operating in his nervous system at a level that conscious intention could not reliably reach, the compulsion moving his body toward action before rational thought could intervene and redirect. Elena was patient with him in the way that only someone who genuinely understood the difference between a person and their supernatural compulsion could be patient. Her love for her brother intact and her hurt at his attacks real, and both things true simultaneously without cancelling each other out. But the situation was not sustainable, and everyone around them understood that with increasing urgency as the incidents accumulated. Damon took charge of Jeremy's training with the particular pragmatism of someone who had decided that the most useful thing he could do was a thing that nobody else was quite willing to do cleanly. Jeremy needed to kill vampires to complete his mark. This was the straightforward fact of the situation, uncomfortable and ethically complicated and nonetheless true, and proceeding as though it were not true. was not going to make Jeremy safer or the mark complete any faster or the cure any closer. Damon found vampires for Jeremy to kill, individuals whose deaths he could frame as necessary removals of genuine threats. The moral accounting involved in these decisions not clean, but not entirely without its own internal logic either. The training sessions between Damon and Jeremy had a quality of unexpected authenticity about them. The two of them working together with the focused efficiency of people who had set aside their complicated history in service of a shared practical goal. Jeremy was stronger than a human boy his age had any natural right to be. The hunter enhancement that came with the mark giving him capabilities that made him genuinely formidable despite his youth and his lack of experience. And Damon trained him with the seriousness that genuine capability deserved, rather than the condescension that might have been easier. They were not friends exactly, but they were something more functional than adversaries. And the work they did together in those weeks was real. Cole Mikkelson's arrival introduced a complication that the group had not anticipated with sufficient seriousness before it became a crisis. Cole was Klaus's brother, one of the original vampires whose existence predated almost everything else in the supernatural world, and his understanding of the Silas mythology was both older and more visceral than anything the group had assembled through their research and their consultations with Shane. Cole had been alive when the original 5 hunters were created. He had been present for conversations about Silas that most supernatural beings only knew through second-hand accounts and ancient texts, and his fear of what Silas's raising would mean was not theoretical or academic, but rooted in knowledge old enough to feel like instinct. He was terrified. This was the genuine and underneath everything else, rather sympathetic truth about Cole's intervention. Whatever the methods he chose to express it, he believed, with the conviction of someone who had spent centuries considering the question, that raising Silas would mean catastrophe on a scale that made the usual supernatural conflicts of mystic falls look like minor disturbances. That the being entombed on the island off Nova Scotia was not simply powerful in the way that original vampires were powerful, but was something fundamentally different and fundamentally more dangerous. Something that the existing supernatural world was not equipped to contain or manage or negotiate with once it was free. His attempts to stop Jeremy from completing his mark were direct and brutal in the way that Cole's approaches to most problems were direct and brutal. The 1,000 years of existence that should perhaps have produced more patience, having instead produced someone who had very little tolerance for obstacles when he had decided what outcome he wanted. He desiccated Jeremy's arm, temporarily disabling the limb and making continued vampire hunting impossible for the period of incapacitation, making his point with a physical emphasis he consistently preferred over more diplomatic communication. The message was clear enough, even without the accompanying explanation. Stop building the mark. Stop pursuing Silas. Stop moving towards something that Cole had lived long enough to understand should not be disturbed. Klaus neutralized the immediate threat Cole posed through the particular leverage that only Klaus possessed over his siblings, but the underlying conflict remained. The question of whether completing Jeremy's mark and finding Silas was worth what finding Silas might cost hanging over the group's continued planning in ways that nobody was entirely able to dismiss. even when they were proceeding as though they had. Elena's decision to tell Klaus's hybrids the truth about their situation was the action that triggered the second massacre, though she had not intended it as such, and the connection between her choice and Shane's plan was not visible to her at the time she made it. Klaus had always told his hybrids that he would eventually release them from their sire bond to him, that their service and their loyalty would be rewarded with genuine freedom once the conditions were right, the promise functioning as the mechanism that kept them compliant and cooperative, despite the fundamental coercion of their situation. Elena, acting with the clarity of someone who understood sire bonds from the inside and found the lie of that promise intolerable, told the hybrids the truth. Klaus would never free them. He needed the sire bond too much to surrender it voluntarily, and waiting for the freedom he had promised was waiting for something that would never arrive. The hybrids turned on Klaus. This was the outcome Elena had intended, the disruption of his hybrid army representing one of the few practical levers available to anyone trying to limit Klaus's power and interference. What she had not intended, what she had no way of knowing because Shane's plan was still operating below the level of anyone's complete understanding, was that Klaus's response to his hybrid's rebellion would be their destruction, that he would kill them rather than lose them, that 12 hybrids would die at his hands in the fury of his betrayal and his wounded pride. 12 hybrids. The second point of Shane's expression triangle, completed by Klaus's own hand, fueled by Elena's intervention, achieved without Shane needing to do anything except allow the pieces he had already put in motion to continue moving. He had known this would happen. The expression triangle was advancing on the schedule he had designed for it, using the group's own actions and intentions as instruments, turning their genuine motivations and their genuine love for each other into machinery that served his purposes without their knowledge or consent. Jeremy's mark grew significantly after the hybrid massacre. The deaths connected to the supernatural, convergence of the moment adding to the tattoo in ways that a comparable number of ordinary kills might not have. The mark expanding across his shoulder and toward his chest, with new complexity and new detail that suggested the map was approaching a more complete form. The physical expansion was visible and rapid, and Jeremy sat with it in the particular silence of someone watching something happen to their own body that they cannot stop and are not certain they should stop. The completion of the mark bringing the cure closer, but also bringing whatever the mark's completion would cost him closer in equal measure. Elena and Damon's relationship deepened through this period, with the organic inevitability of two people who had been given extended proximity in genuine crisis and who had always, underneath every complication, understood each other in ways that the people around them sometimes found difficult to witness. With Stefan having stepped back and Damon actively and practically involved in helping Jeremy, the daily texture of Elena's existence increasingly included Damon in the central rather than the peripheral way, his presence consistent, and his care for the people she loved demonstrated through action, rather than simply claimed through words. The sire bond question remained unresolved, and would remain unresolved for some time yet, but the feelings underneath it, wherever their ultimate origin, were real in the way that things which shape your daily choices and your daily comfort are real. And Elena had stopped pretending otherwise, even when she could not yet say with certainty what they meant. Bonnie's progress in expression magic continued through this period at a pace that concerned the few people who were paying sufficiently close attention. She was performing acts of magical power that her traditional abilities had never approached. Her control over the scale of what she could do expanding with each session she spent working with Shane's guidance. The capabilities she was developing remarkable and also frightening in the way that things without natural limits are frightening. When you understand what the absence of limits actually means. She'd not told her friends the full truth about what she was learning or where the power was coming from. The secrecy not born from dishonesty exactly, but from a protective instinct about information she sensed they would not receive with enthusiasm, and from the particular blindness that comes from wanting something to be safe badly enough to avoid examining whether it is. The mark was close to complete. The cure was closer than it had been since the search began, and underneath the progress and the approaching possibility, Shane's triangle was drawing toward its third and final point with the patience of a plan that had never been in any real danger of failing, because it had been built from the beginning on the most reliable materials available. The love of people who would do almost anything for each other, directed carefully toward ends they had not chosen and would not have chosen if they had understood in time what they were being used to build. There is a particular quality to the moment when a plan that has been building across weeks of careful preparation reaches the point where it can no longer be managed through patience and diplomacy and strategic positioning, where the people involved must make choices that cannot be unmade and accept consequences that cannot be negotiated down to something more comfortable. The events that gathered around Cole Michelson in the weeks following his desiccation of Jeremy's arm had this quality, the situation narrowing steadily toward a confrontation that everyone involved could see approaching, and that none of them found a way to prevent through any of the alternatives they considered before the alternatives ran out. Klaus had been neutralized through Bonnie's expression magic, trapped inside the Gilbert house by a spell that prevented him from leaving or intervening in whatever the group chose to do outside its walls. This was a significant tactical achievement, and everyone involved understood it as such. Klaus's removal from the immediate board representing one of the few occasions when the group had successfully limited his ability to interfere with their plans before the interference occurred rather than after. He was contained, furious, and temporarily unable to do anything except watch through the windows, while the situation outside his enforced boundary developed without him. Cole operated without Klaus's restraint in those days, his fear of Silas making him more aggressive rather than more cautious. The prospect of Jeremy's mark completing and the cure being found and Silas subsequently being raised functioning on Cole's psychology, the way genuine existential terror functions on anyone, stripping away the usual moderating influences and leaving only the drive to prevent the thing that is feared by whatever means are available. He was not simply obstinate or territorial in the way that original vampires were often obstinate and territorial. He was afraid, and his fear had the particular edge of someone who had been afraid of the same thing for a very long time and had watched every previous attempt to address that fear fail to resolve it permanently. He came to the Gilbert house. The decision was direct in the way that Cole's decisions tended to be direct. The 1,000 years of existence that might have taught him subtlety, having apparently taught him instead that direct action, however costly, was more reliable than the indirect approaches that required other people to behave predictably. He came with the intention of ending the problem of Jeremy's mark in the most permanent way available to him, which was to say, he came intending to kill Jeremy, removing the hunter from the equation entirely, and with him the possibility of the mark completing and the map being read and the cure being found and Silas being raised. Elena and Jeremy were inside when Cole arrived, and the dynamic of the confrontation that followed had the compressed and terrible quality of situations where all the options are bad and the question is only which bad option is least catastrophic. Cole was an original vampire, which meant that conventional vampire-killing weapons were useless against him, that his strength and speed exceeded anything Elena could match as a relatively new vampire, and that his intention was entirely clear and entirely serious. Elena had faced original vampires before and had survived those encounters through some combination of help, arriving in time and circumstances breaking in her favor, and the particular stubborn luck that had characterized her survival across 4 years of impossible situations. Jeremy was a hunter of the 5, which meant that fighting Cole was not simply a matter of surviving his attack, but of understanding that his own supernatural capabilities had been specifically designed for exactly this kind of confrontation. The hunter enhancement that had been growing alongside his mark gave him strength and speed and instinct that exceeded normal human capacity in ways that became apparent in the fight. His body responding to the threat of an original vampire with capabilities he had not fully mapped or tested before this moment required him to use them. He was not Cole's equal, but he was more than Cole had perhaps expected. The fight moved through the Gilbert house with the particular chaos of supernatural combat in domestic spaces. The ordinary furniture and walls and doorways of the home, where Eleanor and Jeremy had grown up providing inadequate geography for what was happening within them. Eleanor fought alongside Jeremy, her own new vampire capabilities deployed in service of creating openings and disruptions that bought Jeremy time and positioning, her understanding of the house and its layout giving her a marginal tactical advantage that she used with the focused desperation of someone who understood that marginal advantages were all she had. Jeremy shot Cole with a weapon loaded with white oak ash, the substance capable of incapacitating an original, even if not permanently destroying one. The shot buying them the moment they needed. Elena fed Cole her blood in the immediate aftermath, the action completing the setup for what Jeremy then did, which was to drive a stake through Cole with the full force of his hunter's strength and his hunter's instinct, and the particular resolve of someone who had spent weeks being hunted by this person and had run out of other options. Cole died. An original vampire, one of the first vampires in existence, died in the Gilbert living room at the hands of a teenage hunter and his vampire sister, the confrontation ending with a finality that neither of them had fully processed before the consequences of what they had done began arriving. The consequences of killing an original vampire were not small. They were never small. The sire line that extended from any original vampire through every vampire they had ever directly or indirectly created was vast and old and connected to Cole across centuries of transformation. Hundreds of vampires around the world whose existence was tied to his through the supernatural chain of their creation. When Cole died, his entire sire line died with him, the deaths occurring simultaneously and without warning across every location where a vampire connected to his bloodline happened to be at that particular moment. It was an act of massive and unintended consequence, the killing of one person producing the deaths of hundreds of others. The scale of it impossible to fully comprehend in the immediate aftermath, and not entirely comprehensible even with time and reflection. Jeremy died too, briefly and technically, the mass deaths of Cole's sire line triggering the hunter's curse in reverse, the supernatural shock of so many, connected deaths passing through Jeremy's system with enough force to stop his heart before his ring brought him back. He woke on the floor of the Gilbert house with the ring's resurrection completing and the world reasserting itself around him, and the knowledge of what had just happened settling over him in layers: the kill, Cole's death, the sire line, his own temporary death and return, the mark. The mark had completed. The deaths connected to Cole's sire line had been enough. The map spreading across Jeremy's skin in its final form, with a completeness that was immediately visible. The tattoo covering his hand and arm and shoulder and chest in intricate detail. The accumulated record of his kills, and the kills connected to the original's death assembled into the map that had been building since Connor first appeared in Mystic Falls. It was finished. The path to Silas's tomb was now theoretically readable, encoded in the supernatural cartography written on Jeremy's body, requiring only the correct decoding to reveal the location they had been working toward across months of planning and sacrifice. Klaus's grief at Cole's death was genuine in a way that surprised people who had spent enough time watching Klaus perform emotions for strategic purposes that they had become uncertain about which of his responses were real. He had loved Cole in the complicated and often destructive way that Klaus loved most things. The relationship between them defined by conflict and cruelty, and the particular dysfunction of a family that had spent 1,000 years unable to leave each other and unable to treat each other well simultaneously. But Cole had been his brother, one of the last remaining connections to the world Klaus had come from, to the family that had preceded everything else in his existence, and his death left a specific absence that Klaus's fury at the people who had caused it could not fill or replace. His rage at Elena and Jeremy was immediate and absolute, and expressed with the particular intensity of Klaus's grief, which had always expressed itself most naturally as destruction. He was still trapped inside the Gilbert house, Bonnie's spell holding despite his fury, the boundary containing him while he processed what had happened to his brother through the only emotional register that came easily to him. He threatened consequences. He promised that what he felt about Cole's death would be paid for by the people responsible for it in ways that would be proportionate to the scale of his loss. The threats were credible in the way that Klaus's threats were always credible, not because he was simply volatile, but because he had consistently throughout his existence followed through on what he promised when he was sufficiently motivated. Rebecca moved with the focused purpose of someone who had been waiting for an opportunity and recognized its arrival. She had her own grief about Cole, her own complicated relationship with the brother she had grown up with across a millennium of proximity and conflict, but she had also been working toward the cure with a consistency that her emotions about Cole's death did not displace. She took the sword from Klaus's possession while his attention was consumed by his grief and his rage, the specific sword that decoded the hunter's mark and could translate the map on Jeremy's skin into navigable directions to Silas's tomb. With the sword in her possession and Jeremy's mark complete, the next stage of the search had its necessary components assembled. Shane decoded the sword. This was the piece of the process that required his particular knowledge, the sword's mechanism for reading the hunter's mark being something that the group could not have managed without his expertise, and his willingness to provide that expertise was immediate and helpful in the way that all of his assistants had been immediate and helpful. The pattern of his usefulness so consistent that the question of what he was being useful toward had still not been asked with sufficient urgency by enough of the right people. The sword told them what Shane had apparently already known. The location encoded in Jeremy's mark pointing to an island off the coast of Nova Scotia, remote and ancient and largely uninhabited, the place where Silas had been waiting for 2,000 years for someone sufficiently motivated and sufficiently reckless to come and find him. The group had its destination. The cure was closer than it had ever been, and the cost of reaching this point, measured in Cole's death, and his sire line's destruction, and Jeremy's temporary death, and Klaus's grief, and the third massacre that was still approaching without anyone except Shane, understanding that it was part of a plan rather than a consequence, was already higher than most of them had allowed themselves to fully calculate. There is a specific quality to the calm that settles over a group of people who have committed to a dangerous course of action and past the point where turning back remains a genuine option. It is not peace exactly, and it is not confidence, but it resembles both of those things from the outside. The particular stillness of people who have set aside the question of whether they should be doing what they are doing, because the question no longer serves any useful purpose, and the doing of it requires all the attention they have. The group that assembled for the journey to the island off the coast of Nova Scotia had this quality. The weeks of planning and sacrifice and moral compromise that had brought them to this departure point, producing not triumph or certainty, but the focused and somewhat exhausted resolve of people who had come too far to stop. Stefan, Rebecca, Elena, Damon, Jeremy, Bonnie, and Shane traveled together with the particular tension of a group whose individual motivations for being present did not fully align and whose trust in each other was complicated and uneven, and in some cases essentially absent. Stefan wanted the cure for Elena. Rebecca wanted it for herself. Elena was no longer certain what she wanted and had largely stopped pretending otherwise. Damon was present because Elena was present, his opposition to the entire endeavor having been overridden by his unwillingness to let her go into danger without him, regardless of what he thought about the wisdom of the plan. Jeremy was present because the map was on his body and the cure required his blood, and the hunter's compulsion that had been reshaping his personality for months made him constitutionally incapable of stopping short of completion. Bonnie was present because her magic was necessary to open the tomb, and Shane was present because he had arranged for all of them to be here and understood things about what they were walking into that he had not fully shared. The island presented itself to them as the kind of place that seems to exist outside ordinary time, the kind of geography that has absorbed enough history and enough darkness to carry it in the quality of its air and its light and its particular silence. It was remote in the genuine sense of the word, not simply distant from population centers, but fundamentally apart from the world most people inhabited. The waters around it cold and grey, and the vegetation dense and old in ways that suggested land that had not been substantially altered by human presence across the centuries. The few local inhabitants they encountered in the approach knew the island's legend, or knew enough of it to carry the particular wariness of people who understand that certain places are dangerous without being able to articulate the specific nature of the danger in terms that would satisfy a skeptical listener. Shane led them through the island's landscape with the confidence of someone who had been here before, which he had. His earlier visit to the island part of the preparation for the plan that was now reaching its conclusion. He had walked these paths and descended into these underground passages and stood at the entrance to the place where Silas had been waiting for 2,000 years. And his familiarity with the terrain was both practically useful and quietly revealing to anyone paying careful attention to what his comfort here implied about the nature and duration of his involvement with everything that had brought them to this point. The mythology of Silas expanded during the journey across the island, Shane providing the historical context that the tomb's opening required understanding. The story of the most ancient immortal taking on new dimensions as the physical location of his imprisonment made the legend feel less like legend and more like fact. Silas had been a witch, a practitioner of magic so gifted and so ambitious that he had conceived and executed the creation of a true immortality spell, a working of such fundamental power that it altered the natural order in ways that had rippled outward across 2,000 years of supernatural history. He had intended the immortality for himself and for the woman he loved, a woman named Amara, whose existence had been bound to his with a particular intensity of people who believed their love to be of a different and more absolute quality than ordinary human feeling. Katsia had been the witch who created the immortality spell at Silas's request, and Katsia had believed herself to be the woman for whom the gift was intended. When she discovered that Silas had given immortality to Amara instead of to her, had used Katsia's own creation to secure eternity with someone else, her response had been the response of someone whose love had been weaponized against them and who possessed both the power and the will to exact a consequence proportionate to the betrayal. She killed Amara. She entombed Silas with a cure she had created specifically to undo his immortality, placing it with him so that the hunters who found him would have the means to make him mortal and therefore killable. And she created the other side, the supernatural purgatory, where dead supernaturals went instead of finding peace, designing it specifically to trap Silas there after his death, ensuring that even in dying, he would not find the peace or the reunion with Amara that he sought. The other side was not simply a theoretical construct or a distant consequence of ancient decisions. It was the place where every supernatural being who died went. The dimension where Vicky and Anna and Alaric and everyone else the group had lost existed in a kind of proximity to the living world that fell short of true presence in every meaningful way. Silas's creation had produced it as a side effect of his immortality, and Ketsia's grief and fury had shaped it into the particular form it took, the supernatural purgatory that had been holding the dead since before most supernatural beings in the world had been born. The relationship tensions within the traveling group found their expression in the compressed and unavoidable proximity of the island journey in ways that the structured distances of mystic falls had made easier to manage. Stefan and Rebecca's alliance had developed the warmth of people who had spent extended time in each other's company, working toward a shared goal, their dynamics shifting incrementally from strategic partnership towards something that carried more personal investment and more personal risk. Elena noticed this with the amplified emotional perception of a vampire and felt about it with the complicated mixture of feelings that characterized most of her responses to the people she loved existing in ways that did not require her. Elena and Damon existed in the particular intimacy of two people who had stopped pretending that what was between them was simple or uncertain, or primarily a problem to be solved. The sire bond question hovering over everything without making the daily reality of their connection feel any less real or any less present. They moved through the island together with the ease of people whose bodies have learned each other's rhythms. His hand finding hers on difficult terrain with the naturalness of a habit rather than a gesture. Her awareness of his location constant and comfortable in the way that awareness of something essential becomes comfortable when you stop fighting it. Vaughn appeared on the island with the abruptness of a complication that had not been in anyone's plan. A hunter whose activation had been triggered by the mass deaths of Cole's sire line, and who had arrived on the island through the same combination of instinct and decoded information that had brought their group here. He was a hunter of the five in the same way Jeremy was a hunter of the five. The Brotherhood's supernatural creation producing in him the same enhanced capabilities and the same compulsive orientation toward the mission. But his agenda diverged from Jeremy's at the point that mattered most. Vaughn did not want the cure to restore anyone to human life or to be held in reserve as option. He wanted to use it on Silas directly, to make the ancient immortal mortal and therefore killable, to finish the work the five had been created to complete 2,000 years earlier. He took Jeremy, using the hunter's own capabilities and the element of surprise to overcome him, controlling the group's primary asset at the moment when the asset was most necessary. Bonnie's expression magic on the island operated at a scale that made even the people who'd been watching her develop across the preceding weeks step back and reassess what they were witnessing. The workings she performed in preparation for opening the tomb exceeded anything her traditional magic had ever produced. The power moving through her with a force and a fluency that should have required years of practice at this level, but that expression apparently provided without the gradual accumulation of skill that traditional magic demanded. She was extraordinary, and she was frightening in equal measure. The people who loved her watching her channel this power with the particular discomfort of people who cannot identify exactly what is wrong with what they are seeing, but cannot quite convince themselves that nothing is. The underground passage system beneath the island's surface was ancient in the way that places shaped by fundamental and irreversible magic become ancient. The stone of the walls and the floor carrying something in its texture beyond simple geological age, something that registered on supernatural senses as the accumulated weight of 2,000 years of the most powerful imprisoned being in the world pressing against his containment. The air in the deeper passages had the quality of air that had not been moved or refreshed in a very long time, and the darkness was absolute beyond the light sources the group carried, and the silence between their footsteps had the particular quality of a silence that has been maintained for centuries by the absence of anything living. The tomb's entrance required the components that the entire season had been building toward. Jeremy's blood as hunter, Bonnie's expression magic operating at the scale the triangle had been designed to produce, and the completed mark providing the specific key that opened what had been sealed. The door opened. The chamber beyond it was real and present, and contained what they had come for. And in the moment of opening, with the cold air of the chamber moving past them and the darkness inside waiting to be entered, the particular quality of a plan reaching its point of no return settled over the group with complete finality. They were inside. The tomb was real. Silas was real. And the careful architecture of everything that had brought them here, the months of searching and killing and sacrificing and being manipulated by a professor who had needed their love for each other to fuel his own desperate plan, had delivered them to this threshold exactly as Shane had always intended it to. The cure within reach, and the cost of reaching for it not yet fully visible in the darkness ahead of them. The thing about arriving at the destination you have been working toward across months of sacrifice and moral compromise is that arrival does not feel the way you imagined it would feel during the long period of working toward it. The imagination during that period tends to smooth the destination into something clean and resolved, a place where the questions that drove the journey are answered, and the costs that the journey required are justified by the clarity of what was found at the end of it. The reality of arrival is almost always more complicated than that, the destination revealing itself to contain new questions and new costs and new complications that the journey's forward momentum had not permitted sufficient time to anticipate or prepare for. The group entered Silas's chamber with the particular combination of relief and dread that accompanies the achievement of something that has required everything you had to give, and that you are not entirely certain you should have pursued. The chamber was ancient in its every quality, the stone of its construction carrying 2,000 years of the particular cold that gathers in places sealed from light and air and any movement of living things through them, the darkness absolute beyond the torches and the expression magic that Bonnie used to illuminate their path through the final passages. The silence inside was not simply the absence of sound, but the presence of something accumulated, the weight of centuries of containment pressing against the senses in ways that were difficult to articulate, but impossible to ignore. Shane moved through the chamber with the focused certainty of someone arriving at a place they have been working toward for years. His behavior in the tomb's interior, making the full nature of his investment in the moment unmistakably clear to anyone watching him closely enough. He was not a guide or an academic consultant or a helpful expert sharing his knowledge in service of other people's goals. He was someone completing his own plan, the final stage of a design that had been in execution since before any of them had known his name, and the mask of useful neutrality that he had maintained across months of careful positioning dropped in the chamber with the naturalness of something that was no longer necessary to maintain. His full plan revealed itself in the compressed and terrible clarity of a moment when concealment became pointless, because the point of no return had already been passed. He needed Bonnie to perform the expression triangle's third sacrifice here, on this island, in this location that sat at the convergence of the supernatural energy his months of preparation had been building toward. The third massacre required 12 witches, and the island's position as a site of ancient and concentrated supernatural power had drawn practitioners of magic to its surface in the way that such sites draw those sensitive to them. A gathering of witches whose presence Shane had understood would occur and had factored into his planning long before the group arrived. The massacre of the 12 witches would complete the expression triangle, would give Bonnie the accumulated power of all three sacrifices, and would fuel the magic required to raise Silas from his tomb. The horror of this revelation was not simply that Shane had been lying to them from the beginning, though he had been lying to them from the beginning with a completeness and a consistency that made the extent of their manipulation staggering in retrospect. It was that his plan required Bonnie to be the instrument of the third massacre, that the months of teaching her expression magic had been preparation for this specific moment, that everything he had helped her develop and everything she had come to believe herself capable of was in service of an act she would never have chosen if she had understood what was being asked of her from the start. He had used her grief about her grandmother and her love for her friends and her genuine desire to be powerful enough to protect the people she cared about, had used all of it as the raw material for a weapon he intended to deploy in service of his own devastation. The witches on the island died. The expression triangle completed. The third point locked into place with the terrible finality of a seal being broken rather than set. The magic generated by 3 massacres of the required scale and composition accumulating in the geography of the expression triangle, and in Bonnie herself with a force that was visible, that manifested in the physical world around her as something the people present could see and feel and understand instinctively, as exceeding any normal human capacity to safely contain. She was the triangle's vessel as much as she was its practitioner, the power moving through her rather than simply being wielded by her. The distinction between those two things mattering enormously for questions about what the power was doing to her, even as she used it. Damon was incapacitated during the chaos of the massacre's completion and its magical aftermath, the accumulated power and Shane's maneuvering combining to remove him from the board at the moment when his particular combination of aggression and protective instinct would have been most useful to the people he was there to protect. He was not dead, not even close to dead by vampire standards, but he was neutralized with sufficient thoroughness that the events which followed occurred without him. Stefan and Rebecca moved deeper into the tomb while the chaos held everyone else's attention. Their shared purpose in this moment cutting through the complexity of their alliance and the competing feelings that had developed around it across the weeks of preparation and travel. They were looking for the cure, the single vial that represented the culmination of everything the search had required, and they moved through the chamber's deeper passages with the focused urgency of people who understood that the window of opportunity for finding it before everything else resolved itself was not wide. They found it. The cure was real and physical and present. A small vial containing a dark liquid that carried in its appearance no particular indication of the enormous significance it represented. The modest container entirely inadequate as a vessel for something that could undo 2,000 years of supernatural history, or restore a person's humanity, or end the immortality that had defined the entire architecture of the world they all inhabited. It sat in the chamber where Ketsia had placed it alongside the man she had entombed. Her revenge and her grief crystallized into this small object that had been waiting in the dark for 2,000 years for someone to arrive and claim it. Rebecca took it. She looked at Stefan for one moment with an expression that contained something genuine in it. Something that acknowledged what they had built across the weeks of working toward this together and what she was about to do to it. And then she took the cure and she ran, using the speed of an original vampire to put distance between herself and Stefan before he could respond, leaving him standing in the chamber's deeper passage, with the understanding of what had just happened arriving in the particular way of betrayals that were always possible, and that are nonetheless stunning when they occur. She had always said she wanted it for herself. This was the accurate and important thing to remember in the aftermath. The context that prevented the betrayal from being quite as simple or as clean as it initially felt. Rebecca had been transparent throughout about her motivation for joining the search, had never pretended that her interest in finding the cure was in service of anyone except herself, had stated clearly from the beginning that she wanted to be human again, with a longing that was the most honest and undefended thing about her. The alliance with Stefan had been genuine, and the feelings that had developed within it had been genuine, but the alliance had always been conditional on the search reaching its conclusion. And its conclusion had now arrived, and Rebecca had done exactly what she had always said she would do. Stefan's experience of the betrayal was still the experience of betrayal regardless of its predictability. The feelings that had developed between them across the weeks of proximity and shared purpose, making her departure with the cure feel like more than simply losing the object he had come for. He had let himself believe, in the way that hope overrides calculation when sufficient time and closeness are involved, that the alliance had become something that would survive the moment of its original purpose being achieved, that what they had built together would hold even when the prize was finally in reach. He had been wrong, and the particular quality of being wrong about something you had allowed yourself to hope for is its own distinct variety of loss. Elena and the others reached the chamber's central space where Silas had been contained, the ancient immortal present in the tomb in a form that their approach had not quite prepared them for. He appeared as Jeremy, wearing Jeremy's face with the perfect accuracy of a psychic illusionist who had access to the minds of the people around him and who understood that appearing as someone the group trusted and loved was the most effective possible approach to the problem of managing the people who had arrived to claim the cure he had been interred with. He appeared vulnerable, confused, imprisoned, wearing the face of the person Elena would be most immediately and completely undone by. The manipulation operating through her love with the precision of someone who'd been studying human and supernatural psychology for 2,000 years. The real Jeremy was elsewhere in the tomb, having been separated from the group during the chaos of the expression triangle's completion. His position and his situation not immediately clear to the others who were looking at what they believed to be him standing in the chamber. Silas fed from Jeremy, the ancient immortal's hunger after 2,000 years of entombment, absolute and consuming, draining him with the thoroughness of someone who had been denied sustenance for longer than most supernatural beings had existed, and who had no interest in restraint or mercy, or the careful management of the damage he was causing. Jeremy died on the island. This is the sentence that contains the event, and that cannot be softened through the accumulation of context around it, however much context the event deserves and requires. He died at Silas's hands, drained and broken in the cold of the ancient chamber, the hunter's ring that had saved him from death on previous occasions absent from his finger, lost or removed at some point during the events that had brought them to this moment, the supernatural protection that had functioned as a safety net across years of impossible situations no longer present to catch him. Eleanor found him, and the sound she made was not a sound that anyone who heard it was able to set aside quickly or easily. Silas had been freed. The ancient immortal walked out of his tomb and into a world that had changed beyond recognition across the 2,000 years of his imprisonment, wearing the face of the dead boy, whose sister was kneeling on the stone floor of the chamber, holding what remained of her brother. The monster that Shane had been working to raise departing with the calm of someone who had nowhere particular to be, and all of eternity in which to get there. Bonnie's plan, formed in the grief and desperation of understanding what had just happened to Jeremy, was already taking shape before anyone else in the chamber had found their way out of the shock of everything that had occurred. She would lower the veil between the living world and the other side. She would bring Jeremy back. The expression triangle had given her the power to do it, and she would use that power regardless of what it cost, because the alternative was leaving him in the dark on the other side of a boundary that love alone could not cross. They left the island with Jeremy's body, the group that had arrived with fragile and competing hopes departing with the particular silence of people who had found something far worse than failure at the end of their search. The cure was gone with Rebecca. Silas was free. Jeremy was dead. And Bonnie was carrying inside her the power of 3 massacres and the intention to use it, whatever the cost, to undo the last and worst thing the island had taken from them. Grief, when it arrives at sufficient scale and sufficient speed, does not always produce the responses that people who have not experienced it at that scale tend to expect. It does not always produce weeping or withdrawal, or the particular quiet devastation of someone working through loss at a manageable pace. Sometimes it produces something that looks from the outside like the absence of grief entirely, a stillness and a flatness and a terrifying calm that is not the calm of acceptance or of peace, but of a person whose emotional system has encountered something beyond its capacity to process and has responded by shutting the processing down entirely, by stepping back from feeling with a completeness that protects the person from being destroyed by what they cannot survive feeling fully. Elena came back from the island without Jeremy, and without the cure, and without the particular version of herself that had existed before the island took those things from her. The grief of losing Jeremy was not simply grief for a brother, though. It was that completely and without reservation. It was the grief of someone who had already lost both parents and who had rebuilt the architecture of her existence around the people who remained, around the specific and irreplaceable knowledge that her brother was alive and present, and that whatever else the supernatural world took from her, it had not taken him. That architecture was gone. And Eleanor Gilbert, vampire, 18 years old, with every emotion she possessed amplified beyond the range that human psychology is designed to manage, could not hold what its absence meant without being destroyed by it. Damon made the decision to turn off her humanity switch. He made it the way he made most decisions that he understood to be wrong and necessary simultaneously, with the full awareness of what he was doing, and the equally full awareness that the alternative was watching Elena be consumed by grief so total it would hollow her out entirely, leave her a person-shaped space where a person used to be, functional in no meaningful sense and present in no meaningful sense, grief wearing her like a coat. He told her to turn it off. The sire bond may have been broken or may not have been. The question was still unresolved, but Eleanor followed what he said with the immediacy of someone whose other option was continuing to feel what she was feeling. And the switch went off, and the Eleanor that everyone in Mystic Falls knew and loved went somewhere behind her eyes and did not immediately come back. Elena without her humanity was not simply Elena with her sadness removed. This is the thing that the people who loved her discovered across the weeks that followed. The thing that made the situation more genuinely frightening than a simple grief response would have been. She was intelligent, and she was capable, and she was in full possession of her vampire abilities and her considerable interpersonal perceptiveness, but she was using all of those things in service of nothing except her own amusement and her own comfort, and the particular cold pleasure of a person who has decided that other people's feelings are not a constraint worth respecting. She was cruel with the specific cruelty of someone who knows exactly where the wounds are because she used to care about them, and now simply notes their location as information. She burned down the Gilbert house, the home where she and Jeremy had grown up, where their parents had lived, and where every ordinary memory of her human life was embedded in the walls and the floors and the particular smell of the rooms. She set on fire with the detached efficiency of someone removing an inconvenience, standing in the street and watching it burn with an expression that contained no grief and no nostalgia, and no recognition of what she was destroying beyond the practical acknowledgement that it was destroying. Caroline watched her do it with the horror of someone watching a person they love commit an act they cannot undo. The burning house representing not simply property or even memory, but Eleanor's own deliberate severing of her connection to the person she had been. Stefan and Damon disagreed about how to handle no humanity Elena, with the depth of disagreement that only people who love the same person in fundamentally different ways can achieve on the subject of that person's well-being. Stefan believed in forcing the issue. in creating the circumstances that would make Eleanor confront Jeremy's death, whether she was ready to or not, in treating the humanity switch as something that needed to be forced back on rather than coaxed. Damon believed in a more patient approach, in waiting for the moment when Eleanor herself found reason to return, in trusting that she was still present behind the switch and would come back when she found something worth coming back for. Neither approach was working with any particular efficiency, and Eleanor moved through both of their attempts to reach her with the amused tolerance of someone who finds other people's concern for her mildly entertaining rather than moving. Caroline refused to give up on Elena in a way that was entirely characteristic of Caroline Forbes, and that was also, in the circumstances, an act of genuine courage. Loving someone who has turned off their humanity means loving someone who is actively using your love against you, who knows exactly how much you care and deploys that knowledge as a weapon rather than receiving it as a gift, who is capable of cruelty calibrated to your specific vulnerabilities because they used to care about protecting those vulnerabilities and now simply know where they are. Caroline absorbed Elena's cruelty and maintained her position with the stubborn loyalty of someone who has decided that the person underneath the switch is worth the cost of reaching them, and her consistency across weeks of being treated badly by someone she loved was one of the more quietly remarkable things that season produced. Silas in Mystic Falls was a different and more ambient kind of threat than the direct confrontations the group had managed before. He did not announce himself or position himself as an enemy in ways that would have made his presence legible and therefore manageable. He moved through the town wearing other people's faces with the ease of someone for whom deception was not a tactic, but a fundamental mode of being, the psychic illusionist ability that was his primary power, allowing him to appear as anyone he chose with perfect fidelity. His knowledge of the people around him extracted from their own minds, making the imitation complete and undetectable without specific and concentrated effort to look past it. He appeared most frequently as Stefan, the choice calculated with a particular intelligence of someone who understood that appearing as the person whose face was most familiar and most trusted in the group's central relationships would produce the maximum confusion and the maximum opportunity to manipulate events without direct confrontation. The group could not be certain in any given interaction whether they were speaking to Stefan or to something wearing Stefan's face. The paranoia this produced, undermining their ability to coordinate and communicate and trust each other's reports of what they had seen or heard or been told. The foundation of collective action being eroded by the simple impossibility of verification. His agenda was the permanent lowering of the veil between the living world and the other side, not the temporary lowering that Bonnie had been planning as a means of retrieving Jeremy, but a permanent dissolution of the boundary that Ketsia had created 2,000 years earlier, a permanent opening of the passage between the dead and the living that would release every supernatural being who had ever died into the world of the living without the possibility of returning them to containment. He wanted this because Amara was on the other side, or what remained of Amara after 2,000 years of Ketsia's revenge, and Silas's love for her had survived his imprisonment with a particular intensity of feelings that have had nothing to do except intensify across 20 centuries of isolation and longing. Bonnie was working on the veil's lowering with the knowledge of what it would cost her that she had not shared with the people she loved. Expression magic at the scale of 3 completed massacres was not something a human body could channel without consequence. The power exceeding what human physiology could process and survive, even when the person channeling it was as gifted as Bonnie and as practiced in managing forces that exceeded normal human capacity. She knew this. She had understood it for some time, the knowledge arriving gradually and then with complete clarity, and she had made her decision about it in the particular private way of someone who has decided that the people they love do not get a vote on whether they sacrifice themselves for those same people's benefit. She hid her knowledge from her friends with the careful attentiveness of someone who understands that the people she is protecting would stop her if they knew what she was planning, that the protection of the people she loves requires them to not know in time to intervene. She was present with them and warm with them, and managed her expressions and her responses with enough skill that the secret held through the weeks leading up to graduation, through the chaos of the veil's partial fluctuations and Silas's movements through the town, and the attempts to manage no humanity Elena, and the ongoing question of the cure's location. The expression triangle's presence in the geography of Mystic Falls itself became apparent as the season moved toward its conclusion. The 3 massacre sites forming a triangle mapped onto the town's physical landscape with Mystic Falls at its center. The dark magic concentrated in the town's own soil, and air and water in ways that were affecting the supernatural ecology of the place, in ways difficult to measure but impossible to ignore entirely. The town had always been unusual, had always sat at a convergence of supernatural energies that made it attractive to the kinds of beings that tracked such convergences. But the expression triangle had transformed it into something more specifically and more deliberately charged, a site of concentrated dark magic that was actively affecting the boundary between living and dead. The dead began returning as Bonnie's workings brought the veil to its thinnest point in preparation for the full lowering she was planning for the night of graduation. They did not return with dramatic announcement or physical solidity in all cases, their presence manifesting with varying degrees of substance and clarity, some of them visible only to Jeremy, whose hunter's ability to see the dead gave him access to presences that the others could not perceive directly. Alaric came back with the warmth of someone who had been waiting on the other side with the particular patience of people who died before they were ready and who have not stopped caring about the living they left behind. His presence in Mystic Falls, carrying the specific comfort of something lost being temporarily returned. The grief of everyone who had loved him encountering the strange relief of having him present, and the foreknowledge that relief was temporary, making both the presence and the grief more intense. Lexi returned and found Stefan, and the reunion between them carried the weight of everything that Stefan had been carrying alone since Silas had deposited him at the bottom of the quarry. The weeks of drowning and reviving in the dark and the cold with no company except the gradually increasing psychological damage of an imprisonment designed to be inescapable and indefinitely prolonged. Lexi was his oldest friend, the person who had pulled him back from the edge more times than anyone else in his immortal life, and her temporary return gave him something to hold on to while the chaos of graduation and Silas and no humanity Eleanor and Bonnie's secret converged around them all. Stefan's imprisonment at the quarry was the detail that the season had been holding in reserve, the piece of information that recontextualized every interaction the group had believed they were having with Stefan across the weeks of Silas's presence in Mystic Falls. The real Stefan had been at the bottom of the quarry in a safe, drowning and reviving on the cycle that a sealed metal container submerged in cold water produces. The experience of repeated death and return in isolation and darkness, producing psychological damage whose full extent would take time to understand and longer to address. Silas had been wearing his face and walking through his relationships and using his trusted presence to manipulate the people Stefan loved, while Stefan himself was locked in the dark, experiencing the particular horror of a suffering that left no marks because vampires healed everything except the memory of the pain. Bonnie brought the veil down on the night of graduation with the full power of the expression triangle moving through her. The accumulated sacrifice of 3 massacres and months of preparation channeling into the working with a force that was visible as light and felt as pressure, and that accomplished what it was intended to accomplish with complete and devastating efficiency. The veil came down. The dead who'd been waiting on the other side moved toward the opening with the urgency of people who've been separated from the living they love for longer than separation should last. She died quietly and alone, the way she had always suspected she would die when she finally accepted that this was the direction the season was taking her. The power exceeded what her body could contain, the final working drawing from reserves that went past the point of survivable depletion. And Bonnie Bennett, who had spent 4 years being the person who sacrificed herself so that the people she loved could continue, made her final sacrifice with the particular dignity of someone who chose it, rather than had it taken from them. She died with the veil down, and Jeremy nearby, and the full knowledge that what she had done would save the people she was leaving behind. She did not tell them. She kept the secret past the point of her own death, remaining present as a spirit during the chaos of graduation in ways that only Jeremy could perceive, communicating through him with the careful management of someone who understood that the people she loved needed to be functional through the crisis before they could be allowed to grieve, that her death was information that would have to be delivered at the right moment and in the right way if it was going to be survivable for the people receiving it. Graduation day in Mystic Falls arrived with the particular surreal quality of a milestone occurring inside a crisis. The ordinary human ceremony of caps and gowns and proud families, and the particular solemnity of young people standing at the threshold of whatever comes next, proceeding against a backdrop of the veil between living and dead sitting at its thinnest point, and the dead walking among the living with varying degrees of substance and intention. The town had spent 4 years absorbing the impossible into its ordinary rhythms, had learned to hold supernatural catastrophe alongside school schedules and town events and the persistent requirements of daily life. And graduation represented the most extreme version of that capacity. The community gathering to mark a human milestone while the boundary between worlds fluctuated around them. The dead who had returned through Bonnie's working moved through Mystic Falls with the range of motivations that death apparently does not simplify or resolve. Some of them had come back with love and with the desire to say the things that dying before the right moment had prevented them from saying. Some had come back with unfinished business of darker varieties, the grievances and the hungers that death had interrupted, rather than concluded, finding expression again in the temporary return that the lowered veil provided. The living navigated the presence of the dead with the particular mixture of joy and dread and grief that encounters with the irreversibly lost tend to produce. The happiness of the reunion inseparable from the knowledge of its temporary nature. The presence of the beloved dead, making their absence more rather than less acute. Alaric's reunion with Damon happened on the margins of the graduation chaos with the quality of something both of them had needed without knowing how to ask for it. Alaric had been Damon's closest friend in the particular way that friendships between people who do not easily make friends tend to be close. The relationship built on honesty and mutual exasperation, and the shared experience of caring about the same people and disagreeing about how to protect them and being right in roughly equal proportion. His death had left a space in Damon's life that nothing subsequent had filled, and his temporary return gave Damon the thing that grief most frequently denies the grieving, the chance to be in the presence of the person they lost one more time, and to say the things that the original death had not provided time or opportunity to say. They were together for hours, and the reunion was not ceremonial or sentimental in its texture, but deeply real, the two of them existing in each other's company with the ease of people for whom the passage of time in separation has not altered the fundamental comfort of proximity. Cole returned through the veil with less benign intentions, his death at Jeremy and Elena's hands still recent enough and significant enough that his presence in Mystic Falls carried threat alongside whatever more complicated feelings his return might have contained. The veil's lowering had not curated its returnees for harmlessness or goodwill, had simply opened the boundary and allowed the dead to move as their own natures directed them, and Cole's nature directed him toward the accounting he had not had the opportunity to complete before the white oak stake ended his original existence in the Gilbert living room. Klaus returned to Mystic Falls during the graduation crisis, having been absent from the central action for some time. His return timed with the particular instinct of someone who monitors the supernatural landscape of places they consider their territory, and who recognizes when the level of activity in such places exceeds what can be safely ignored from a distance. He arrived carrying werewolf venom as both weapon and leverage, the specific venom from Connor's modified weapons having already been deployed against Damon with effects that were progressing toward the threshold beyond which vampire physiology cannot recover without intervention. Damon was dying in the way that werewolf venom kills vampires. The hallucinations and the fever, and the gradual systemic failure advancing along their predictable timeline. The outcome certain without hybrid blood to counteract what the venom was doing. Klaus healed Damon. He provided his hybrid blood with the characteristic mixture of genuine feeling and strategic calculation that defined most of Klaus's acts of apparent generosity. His reasons never entirely simple, and his actions nonetheless real in their effects regardless of the complexity of the motivations behind them. The healing was partly for Caroline, whose grief at the prospect of losing Damon was something Klaus observed and responded to through his love for her, even when that love expressed itself in indirect and imperfect ways. It was partly acknowledgement of the particular respect that exists between beings who have been adversaries long, enough to understand each other's nature with genuine accuracy. And it was partly simply Klaus being Klaus, capable of unexpected mercy when the circumstances aligned with whatever internal calculus he applied to decisions about who deserved it. Rebecca and the cure occupied the central strategic question of the graduation day crisis. The single vial that she had taken from the tomb on the island still in her possession, still representing the only dose of a substance that could restore a vampire's humanity, and that multiple people wanted for different and competing reasons. Matt had been present throughout the season as the human at the center of a supernatural world. His humanity consistent and grounding, and occasionally the only perspective in the room not distorted by supernatural ability or supernatural agenda. And his conversation with Rebecca carried the weight of someone who had watched her from an honest distance and had formed a view of her that was not distorted by fear or history or supernatural complication. He told her that she had a chance at something most people who wanted human life could not actually access. That wanting to be human and having the means to become human were not the same thing, and that she was in the extraordinarily rare position of possessing both simultaneously. But human life required more than simply removing vampire nature, he said. It required something to live it for, a direction and a purpose, and a genuine engagement with the world, rather than simply the exchange of one kind of existence for another. He asked her what she would do with a human life, what she wanted from it beyond the removal of immortality, and the question reached something in her that the cure itself had not quite reached. The distinction between wanting to stop being something and knowing what you want to be, instead suddenly clarifying in ways that changed what the vial in her hand represented. She gave the cure to Elena. The decision carried its own complicated layers of meaning. The 1,000-year-old original vampire who had spent the entire season working toward this single vial, handing it to someone else in a moment that was not dramatic or announced, but simply quiet and direct. Rebecca, acknowledging through the act that Eleanor's need was more immediate than her own desire, that whatever she decided about her own future could be decided without the cure being the instrument of that decision. Eleanor took it with the understanding of what it had cost to find it, and what it had cost Rebecca to give it up, and the full weight of both of those costs present in the moment of exchange. Eleanor's humanity came back before she used the cure, forced open by a confrontation that Stefan and Damon and Caroline had engineered together, with the understanding that no humanity Elena would not choose to feel unless the choice was made unavoidable. They created the circumstances that made Jeremy's death impossible to process from behind the switch, that placed the full reality of losing her brother directly in front of her without the distance the switch provided, that required her to either feel it or to defend the switch's presence so actively that maintaining it would cost more than letting it go. The switch broke. The grief that had been waiting behind it arrived with the complete and devastating force of grief that has been damned rather than processed. Months of suppressed feeling returning simultaneously with the full intensity that vampire emotion always produced. Eleanor experiencing the loss of Jeremy, at the volume that the switch had been protecting her from since the island. She was barely functional in the immediate aftermath, the grief moving through her with the force of something that had been held back under pressure and that released without moderation or stages, Caroline holding her through the worst of it with the particular steadiness of someone who has been waiting for this moment and prepared for what it would require. The people who loved her gave her the time and the space that the grief demanded, understanding that the return of her humanity was not the resolution of her pain, but the beginning of her ability to actually process it, that the switch going back on meant she had chosen to feel what Jeremy's death meant, rather than continuing to protect herself from it. The cure sat in Elena's possession as graduation proceeded around her. The question of what to do with it no longer abstract now that the search had concluded and the vial was real and present, and the decision was immediate rather than theoretical. She could take it. She could become human again, could reverse the transition that Wickery Bridge had forced on her, could step back across the threshold into the mortality and the vulnerability and the ordinary human life that had been taken without her consent. She had wanted this at the beginning of the season with the uncomplicated urgency of someone who had lost something precious and wanted it returned. She chose to give it to Damon instead, in the moment when the werewolf venom was advancing and Klaus's arrival with his hybrid blood was not yet certain, and the practical question of his survival was immediate and pressing. She placed the cure in his hands with the full awareness of what she was surrendering, and with the full awareness of why she was surrendering it. The choice not made from obligation, or from the sire bond, or from any of the external pressures that had complicated her feelings across the entire season, but made from the clear and present knowledge of what she valued more than her own humanity. Damon refused it. He looked at the vial and looked at Elena and refused with the characteristic directness of someone who has examined the question and arrived at a position they are not interested in debating. His preference for existing as a vampire over existing as a human, not a performance or a deflection, but a genuine and considered expression of who he was and what he wanted his existence to be. Klaus arrived and healed him, making the cure's presence in that moment moot as a practical matter. But the exchange itself mattered beyond the practical question of Damon's survival, the offering and the refusal constituting a kind of conversation about what they were to each other that needed no additional words. Silas's final revelation arrived through Stefan, or through the person the group had believed to be Stefan. The unmasking occurring in the confrontation that brought the season's central mystery to its conclusion. Bonnie had made Silas a witch again, had removed his immortality in the period before her death. The working she performed restoring him to the state of a mortal witch, powerful but finite, killable in the way that all mortal things are killable. Stefan, the real Stefan, recovered from the quarry with Lexi's help, and with the focused anger of someone who has spent weeks in darkness and cold and repeated death processing exactly what he intended to do when he finally got free, confronted Silas and petrified him, turning the ancient immortal to stone in the way that Ketsia had originally contained him. The reversal of his immortality making the petrification possible in ways it would not have been when Silas still possessed the full extent of his original power. Stefan took Silas's petrified body and sank it back into the water. The decision made with the exhausted pragmatism of someone who has run out of better options and who needs the immediate problem contained even if the permanent solution remains incomplete. The water received the stone figure with the indifferent finality of deep places, and Stefan stood at the edge of it and breathed, and the season's central supernatural threat settled into temporary resolution. Bonnie's death was told to her friends through Jeremy, who'd been communicating with her across the weeks of the graduation crisis through the hunter's ability that allowed him to perceive the dead, who had known what she was carrying and had honored her wish to keep it from the others until the crisis was past. He told them at graduation, standing in the sunshine with the particular grief of someone who has been holding a truth alone for too long and who is finally allowed to set it down. She was on the other side, he said. She was watching them. She wanted them to know she loved them, that she had made the choice she made because it was the right choice, that she was at peace with it even if she wished the circumstances had allowed for a different ending. Elena chose Damon after the cure was gone, and the sire bond question was finally and completely moot. Her humanity restored and her grief present and her perception of her own feelings clear in the way that feelings are clear when every supernatural complication obscuring them has finally been removed. She knew herself now as a vampire in ways she had not known herself as a human, had been through the switch and back, and had stood at the edge of every possible version of her own nature. And the person she was on the other side of all of that looked at Damon and chose him without reservation and without the shadow of compulsion over any part of the choosing. The season ended with the particular quality of conclusions that are genuinely conclusive about some things and genuinely unresolved about others, the way real endings tend to be, rather than the clean resolutions that the imagination prefers. Bonnie was dead and present in the specific way of people who exist on the other side of the veil, close enough for Jeremy to feel and far enough for everyone else to grieve. Stefan was damaged and isolated and carrying Silas's petrified body and the psychological weight of the quarry. Eleanor was herself again, fully and with full cost. And Jeremy could see Bonnie, and he told her he would find a way back for her. And she told him through his perception that she knew he would try. And the summer stretched ahead of all of them with the particular openness of a world that had survived something enormous and was not yet certain what came next. And so the fourth season of Mystic Falls closes, not with triumph exactly, but with survival, which in this town has always been its own particular form of victory. Eleanor Gilbert died on a bridge and woke up as something new, and spent an entire season learning that what she had become was not simply a problem requiring a solution, but a life requiring the courage to live it fully. Bonnie Bennett gave everything she had so that the people she loved could stand in the sun at graduation and breathe, and ask for nothing in return except for Jeremy to know she was still there. Stefan endured weeks of darkness and cold and came back anyway. And Damon Salvatore, who had spent a lifetime pretending not to care about anything, was loved freely and clearly by someone who had every reason to choose otherwise. Dae's cure was real, the cost was real, and every choice made across this long and difficult season was made by people who loved each other imperfectly and completely and without reservation. So rest now, gentle dreamers, Let the town of Mystic Falls settle into its quiet, and let the night carry you softly into sleep, where all the lost things wait just on the other side of the dark. Good night.